gentlemen. This is Onar. Onar, do I hear you?
I can hear you.
Ah, very good. Mr. Cropper is here with Onar from Norway, right?
That's right.
Very good. Now, what I feared was going to happen has happened. Oh, my camera's not on. Sorry, let me get this. What I feared was going to happen has happened. I had occasion to discuss what we were covering the other night, and I had no video to refer them to because we hadn't been recording. So
I actually watched the video, the 3-hour video with, who was it? David? No, Brandon?
There was Doug, and I did...
Doug.
Yeah, was it Doug?
Yeah. And I heard you mention the Chinese topic there. That was interesting.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking that, hey, that sounds awfully familiar to what we were talking about. And then you actually mentioned what we were talking about. So
yeah, and it was a good integration because, and just to let the people know, we're talking about the idea that a writing system can be a cognitive shackle on people, and if you have a good writing system, it can cognitively help the spread of information, and a bad writing system can stifle that. And so he was going on and on about the Middle East and hieroglyphics and Egypt and stuff. And then I just said, well, then China too, and integrated like that for him. So there are people out there who are thinking about this, and they haven't realized that there's a mega example. There's the whole eastern sphere of the world that's trapped in like a hieroglyphic system.
Actually, the very idea of thinking of it as a hieroglyphic culture or system, that's interesting. I mean, the way I approached it was from imperialism. It's that empires need to have hieroglyphs because you have multiple languages, and in order for the multiple languages to communicate, you need to have some common symbolics. And instead of then being able to speak to each other, you can write to each other, and that's basically what China is. It's like have incredibly many local languages, spoken languages, but only one written language that goes back like 3,000 or 4,000 years.
Yeah.
And it's imperialistic because you have to have the central bureaucrats that control language. Because who makes the symbols, and how do you know what that symbol means? You have to have some kind of bureaucratic system for that. Whereas if you have written language like we have based on phonetics, anyone can just read whatever words you write. So it's very much more individualistic.
Which I have to add, so the East does that. They control their language. They have a language bureau that approves and makes new things and stuff. The West, we can make up our own words, except for France. They would not allow the use of the term email or fax. They wouldn't allow it in their language. They had their own stupid French version of the words, and they have an official bureau. But we can see what kind of a society they create then when they try to do that, and that's China.
There is actually another country in Europe that does that. It's not only France.
Who else?
Iceland.
Oh, really?
Iceland has not a single imported word. Every single word in their language is Icelandic, like native. And what happens is that people still speak English very, very well. Everyone speaks English almost like their second first language. But so when they start talking about email or whatever words they import, they use it in English as like natively. But when they are talking in their own language, they translate it. So what happens is that it does work like it's a mixture. It's like a mixed version of the Chinese or the Asian system and the European system, because it comes organically. There's no central authority that determines what kind of words people use. But once a word has organically grown to become very popular, such as email, then the central authorities say, okay, now let's make an Icelandic word out of it.
Huh. Interesting. Yeah, they do have to use English. Hell, there's only 300,000 people there, isn't there? Something like that. 330,000.
Something like that. Yeah.
So that's like a very small city. So they've got to. They're not going to be able to preserve. I wonder how long they'll be able to even preserve the Icelandic language itself. Another 100 years.
That's why they're doing this.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting.
They're saying that if they didn't do this, there would be no Icelandic language.
Yeah. Which is possible. I've heard one or two languages disappear every week right now.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is, the reason I'm bringing up Iceland here is that Iceland was basically like anarchists escaping from Norway when Norway was unified as one kingdom, like 1,000 years ago. And these anarchists, they didn't want to live under the rule of one king, and so they just fled. And they had a little stopover in Ireland to pick up wives, and then they went to Iceland. So Iceland is basically like the outpost of Norwegian anarchists. And for 400 years, they had what was known as the Icelandic Free State. So they were basically like a semi-anarchistic society for 400 years. It eventually did collapse, and it eventually was taken over, in fact, by the Norwegian king that came after them. But they did manage to keep it afloat for 400 years. It's called anarchist by anarchists. It wasn't really anarchist, but it was very close to anarchism.
What? Just no central government?
What they had is that they had private police. They had centralized laws. So they had their Congress. They have like 7 or 8 tribes that lived various places in Iceland, and they gathered in Congress to make the laws. But whenever someone actually did something wrong that violated these laws, you could just put up a contract for a private contractor. It says he killed someone, and as long as you had approval from the Congress that, yeah, sure, this guy was a murderer and he violated this law, then you just have a contract out for anyone who wanted to enforce that law. And it did work for a long time.
That's interesting. It sounds a lot like contract theory and the modern anarchist thing. Do you have like a book or a source about a historical source or essay or book about this?
Unfortunately, I don't. I sort of only have I'm able to repeat what I've heard from anarchists who like to talk about this. But I can't recall any sources or something like that. But it should be in the literature. Like for many years, I actually was working on. I'm still working, but very low level, on like building a free state in Africa or possibly some other place in the world. And I was actually going quite well. I was having good contacts far up into the government of a poor country in Africa. But basically it's stranded on the fact that I'm just a nobody, and if I got like Peter Thiel or PayPal or someone like huge with me, then they could go along with it. But as long as it's only me, and they liked the ideas, and they were very fascinated by creating like something like you can call it an economic free zone, but it would be more like Hong Kong, like an enclave of yes, like a free state.
Yeah, I worked a lot on ideas like that, and I decided I could do anything from a 10 by 10 mile patch, just 10 miles on a side, to a 100 by 100 mile patch, to a whole country. I decided anything on any scale would work for a first step for an actual free state, and we could just lease it the way Hong Kong was leased by Britain. But I believe now that if that were to happen, if you were to set it up, you would be very quickly smeared, infiltrated, and destroyed by the left, just like they did with Chile and Pinochet.
That is also the reason why I don't think that it cannot be an ideological project. Like, there exists a free state today, pretty much, like apart from Hong Kong, but like an actual country that is like Hong Kong mostly, and that's Singapore. No one talks about Singapore because it's just the most freaking awesome country on the planet. Like, if I don't know if you've been to Singapore, but
No.
if you should go there. And the first thing that happens when you land in Singapore and you start like just experiencing Singapore, it's like, oh, that's what a well-run country looks like. It's like you get the impression that all the things that people are moaning and complaining about in the US or in Europe, it's been fixed in Singapore. So I'm just going to give you one example. In my hometown in Norway, it is the size of like 400 square kilometers. It's about the size of Singapore, the large area. But in my place, there's only 250,000 people living in my city area. In Singapore, there are 5 million people, 20 times that number. But there's more traffic jam in my area than in Singapore. There's no rush hour. Oh, there's a rush hour where things go slow, but there's no like traffic jam in Singapore. There's like 5 million people into this tiny area, and it's just working. Everything works fine, and it's because they've basically utilized the best of government combined with free market forces. So their major thing that they've solved there when it comes to the traffic, is that they first tried to have like these toll roads, and it wasn't working. And they tried to put tax on the cars, new taxes on cars, didn't work. People just bought lousier cars to avoid the taxes. So eventually they found the solution. They say, we actually have a supply-demand issue here. We know how much we can supply of new cars every month based on our roads. We're the supplier. So we're actually just going to auction a license to own a car based on how many like new cars we can fit on the road based on how much we've built.
Because they're an island, right?
Huh?
Because they're an island, right? They only have so much room.
Yes, it's a very small island. And so basically they auction every month, and the highest bidder get the available seats. And this results in quite high prices for the license. But this also means that all the cars are spotless and really freaking nice in Singapore, because the actual price of the car is small compared to the license. And there's basically no rush traffic. And then they say, okay, we are going to use toll booths in addition to this for handling like what they call fine tuning. So during rush hour, they are putting on extra payment. So you're paying more during rush hour, right, just to make people give them incentive to try to not use the car or to try to drive outside these hours. And it works. Yeah. And so they're taking the income and they're saying, all of this is going to be earmarked for transportation. Not a single dime is going to be used for anything other than transportation. And what they're saying is that we have to give people who cannot afford cars an option. So they're spending like 20% of the income from the roads for public transport and for pavements and stuff like that, so that people can walk, people can use bicycles or these other alternatives. And the result is that the subway system there is incredibly cheap. You can cross the island for less than $1 in the subway, and the bus is even cheaper than that. It's amazing how cheap it is for ordinary people. So when I was every time I'm there, I'm just amazed at how little money I spend on transportation. It's just wow, and all the traffic you see everywhere else, there's just not that problem in Singapore.
Wow, interesting. I know that they're an amazing an amazing place, but I didn't know that about their.
What they did is that they said the following: okay, we're going to license out the subway system. to the on the market. If there are people out there who can run this subway well, they're allowed to do that for profit, but they have to fulfill certain criteria, and that's what they're doing. And the same is with the airport. The airport is privately owned, and it's on a stock exchange. But they're licensing the right to operate an airport, and if they don't do their job, the government will take away their right to license it. So it's a private-public kind of relation. So everything that's borderline government things like transportation is they've tried to solve it as much as possible with private solutions.
Yeah. Now, I don't know what a totally private solution would look like. I've come to the conclusion that governments are going to want to have control of roads and cars just because they want to have track of people and what they're doing. Just from a control freak's perspective, no government's ever going to give up on controlling those things. I don't think. I doubt. So we've got to come to some rational way of handling it as much as we can with the free economy, because even consensual societies probably are going to want to know who's driving around in them.
Yes. So the government has to play some kind of role in there. And of course, that's a big discussion in and of itself. But given the fact that Singapore was founded by a social democrats, a People Actions Party. Listen to that name, People's Actions Party. I mean, it sounds almost communist, right?
Yeah.
Anything that has people in it and action, that's usually very socialist. And they were part of the International Socialist Organization until 1975, when they were kicked out. They've been they have a mix of very targeted socialism and nationalism built into their system, but mostly it's private. So if you look at the OECD countries, it's the one that has the highest amount of immigration. There's no country in the world that is more immigration heavy, intense than Singapore.
They have high immigration in Singapore?
Extremely high. 40% of the population is like non-citizens.
Oh, but fairly local immigration from other areas in Asia, I assume.
A lot of it is from the ASEA countries, the Asian Southeast Association.
Economic Community, yeah.
Yeah.
So we're not gonna go there and see a bunch of Africans and white people.
There are Africans there.
A bunch of Africans and white people running everything.
There are lots of whites in Singapore, refugees from the West, and there are also Africans there, but there are not so many. Mostly there are Asians. However, this is very important. We're now sort of getting into a little bit what we were wanting to talk. We're going to get to Objectivism and on all of that later.
It's gonna get to us no matter what we do. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me give you a start by using Singapore to define what an Objectivist is, or a partial definition.
All right.
It's like, if you think that Trump is the problem rather than the symptom of the problem, then you're an Objectivist.
Nice, very good formulation. And Trump is a symptom. And
yes.
And he's a symptom that we don't mind very much, maybe. We're like, oh, that we can live with this symptom. At least we didn't have the other symptom, like a toothache instead of vomiting. Do you want a toothache or do you want to vomit constantly? You know, which symptom do you want? So
right.
Hillary we would be vomiting everywhere. With Trump, we're just going, oh dear, oh dear.
Yes. Now, so generally speaking, populism is a problem. And the problem with populism is that anything that's new, anything that's not tested, is usually just crap. So if you have a new party, a new kind of ideology, anything new, it's usually just horrible, awful.
Yeah, but somebody has pointed out that new things usually are crap, and they usually are horrible, and they usually are awful. So
That's right.
So it's best for us to defend the system tooth and nail, and only let it expand and grow when something really is proven to be a good idea.
That's right. But so here's the thing: if you think that, like, you should be afraid of populism, because I mean, Hugo Chavez was a populist, and Adolf Hitler was a populist. But there are good populists also.
Yeah.
Like Lee Kuan Yew was the leader of Singapore. He has, you could call him a populist, although he's been the ruling party, like the People's Actions Party have been the ruling party of Singapore for 60 years or 50 years, and they've had consistently more than 50% of the votes. Like sometimes they've had up to 80% of the votes. And it's an actual democracy. I mean, they've put in place a little barriers for other parties, but it is actually democratic. And what Lee Kuan Yew said is that if populism arises in your country, then you're not doing your job. So if your definition of populism is anything other than the failure of the elites of doing their job, then you are part of the problem. And if you are an objectivist, would be someone who focuses on the populists rather than on the idiots who forced people to vote for populists.
That's a good analogy, yeah.
So what I'm saying is that most people are not very demanding. Like, if you just leave people alone, the ruling elite can do whatever they want, more or less. People are not very picky and choosy.
Yeah.
So if the elite, all the elite has to do is to not be an idiot and not do something completely stupid, just try to be meritocratic as much as possible, so people are not going to complain. And it's not very hard to do. If you're a talented part of the elite and you're doing your job, you're going to sit forever. No one's going to overthrow you, because why would they? It's only if you are such an arrogant bastard and doing such awfully idiotic things that people are actually starting to wake up and want to try something new, that they're going to vote for populists.
Yeah.
So the fact that Trump was elected is a huge screw you to both the Republican and the Democratic Party. Basically, what the American people said is that these two parties were so goddamn awful, horrible, that they were willing to vote for a buffoon to have as their president.
I think one of the things that made him the most popular was his buffoonery.
Yes.
I mean, saying stuff like, only Rosie.
Yes.
You know, nobody's allowed to say it.
He won the election there.
He won the election that day with that comment.
Yes.
No other Republican would say that because they don't want to be rude.
Yes. And whereas, like, for instance, Mitt Romney, when he was accused of being a millionaire, he said, "I'm not really that rich." When Donald Trump was accused of being rich, "I'm much richer than that."
Yeah.
That's just like,
he said, "7 billion? What's this 7 billion? I got more than 11 billion." Yeah.
Yes. So he was bragging for being much richer than he was blamed for being, and people like that. And the reason they like that, because the left see him as a wolf, but he's a sheepdog. A sheepdog looks very much like a wolf, but the sheepdog protects the sheep from the wolves.
Or are we the sheep and the left is the sheepdog, and Donald Trump is coming to fight the sheepdog so he can have us?
No. The wolf eats us. The wolf eats us.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump...
And that's what the left does. And the thing is, every single one who votes for Donald Trump, when they say, he's a buffoon, yes, but he fights. Yeah. He's so rude, yes, but he fights.
Yeah.
But he's not acting presidential, yes, but he fights.
Yeah.
But he's doing protectionism, and he's doing sort of lots of things that are not really very Republican or conservative. Yes, but he fights.
Yeah. And the tariffs are part of the fight. He said, I'll put tariffs on you, Mexico, if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And everybody yelled about it for a while, but then Mexico went and sent a bunch of troops to their southern border. So,
yes, finally.
Yeah, exactly. Finally. And they weren't going to, and they were saying it's not our problem and we can't do it and blah, blah, blah. And then they did it. Now, before we move past it, I just want to give my appraisal of the left, which I have done before, the left versus the right, because this is populism. And so I just want to answer to what you have said. And I agree with what you said. We're just talking about ways to analogize it. But my analogy of the left versus the right, which applies not only today, but for the past 100 years or more, my analogy is that the left is a group that sticks together and all believes the same thing, and the right is everybody else. All the individualists just going about their business. And the right only get together once in a while when they're particularly under egregious attack by the left. And the left are always together. They're just the groupthink people. So there is, and so you're describing them as the bureaucrats or whatever. And the right is the rest of society, the economy, just doing their thing. And once in a while the left gets really egregious and the right fights back. And the right is just the scattered people trying to do their thing. The left is groupthink collectivists, anti-individualists.
Yes, I think that you've nailed it there. That we're a flock of cats, or herding cats is difficult, but they are like a pack of wolves, and they want to eat stuff and then control stuff. So I think you're right about that. They're constantly colluding and constantly, and not like actively making like a huge grand plan of things, but their very nature is conspiratorial. They are like every single one of them thinks about how can we act together as collectively so that we can achieve our goals.
Yeah.
So it's part of their creed. So
it's slow moving. It's like a slow cancer. Like in the 40 years that it took them to take over the American university system and corrupt it beyond all recognition, PayPal was built, Google was built, GE went out of style. It used to be a mega corporation, now it's nobody. The economy created all these amazing things and grew and developed and changed. Meanwhile, they're doing this very boring project of taking over the educational institutions. But they achieved it, and it seems to be more important than all the companies we built in the meantime.
Yes, and I'd like to add there that it's not like they were in 1950 saying, oh, we're going to make a 50-year plan for taking over the education system. It's just that people who are on the left tend to be attracted to so-called human or social sciences or social professions. So they don't like working with things, like producing things, doing work. So you're not going to find them using a shovel to shovel dirt or something like that, real actual work.
It occurs to me that Mr. Cropper uses a shovel to shovel objectivism around, and the oblectivists don't do real work, do they? They're like bureaucrats who sit and don't apply it to reality or something like that. And this is the real work of actually shoveling objectivism here and there to dig a real ditch or something. Yeah.
And I think it was Stephen Hicks has said something wonderful. It's that when you're an intellectual, you're working with words. You're not doing real work. And it's much easier to do things in your head when you just have to fantasize something than to actually do it in the real world. And that's why they have, first of all, they have these crazy ideas about how simple it is to do things. That's why they are fundamentally progressive. Anyone who has done actual work in the real world is not a progressive, because he knows how freaking hard it is to get progress. So you know that whenever you get to claw yourself ahead just 1 inch, you better just hold on to that progress as much as you can.
Yeah.
Because it came hard, it ain't cheap, and you had to pay with blood, sweat, and tears.
That's what I appreciate about Donald Trump. He knows that to get one building finished and open is an accomplishment.
Yes.
Or one golf course, or whatever. He knows that. He knows the difficulty in doing anything and the importance in accomplishing things. And the left has no idea, because they stick together in groups and they take over institutions that have a stream of easy money coming into them, namely the government.
Yes. I'd like to finish up a little bit on Singapore before we continue this. This is part of the flow. I just wanted to mention something, that people think that you can't have immigration without getting people pissed off at the high level of immigration. Well, Singapore is the country to learn from, because Singapore was born out of a civil war, an ethnic racial civil war out of multiculturalism, and it recently was like 50 years old. So I think it was in 1965 it was born. So it's 54-year-old country today, and the way it was born, it was Malaya and Singapore was joined together into Malaysia. So the Shia in Malaysia is actually Singapore. So, and the issue is the following. Expat Chinese who hated totalitarianism in China, fleeing the emperor, they went out of China and tried to build a life as entrepreneurs and as settlers and expats elsewhere. And they came, among other places, to Malaysia, or Malaya at the time. And they were incredibly successful. They are sometimes referred to as the Jews of the East. Very intelligent, very like good business people, good with money, very hardworking, and they claw themselves ahead wherever they go. So this, they are sort of they're very similar to the gypsies, but on the other side of the bell curve. So everyone hates the gypsies because they create a lot of trouble wherever they come, whereas everyone hates the Jews and the Chinese because they take over wherever they come, because they're so freaking smart and hardworking and very very good with money and with just climbing up. So what happened in Malaya is that the Chinese took over the cities. They took over the universities, they took over the businesses, everything. So the Malays, they were saying, hey, we're about to become a minority in our own country. There were 40% Chinese at the time in the country, and they were controlling everything. And you had these Malays who are tropical people who like picking bananas and chilling out all day long. They were not happy that they were suddenly becoming like second-rate citizens in their native country. And you can understand that. I mean, hello, this is... look at what happened to the Native Americans or to any other, like the Aboriginals in Australia. If you become a minority in your native lands, you're probably not going to end up in a very good place. And so they were very anxious about that, and very understandably so. And so they started then to really discriminate the Chinese, like really racist policies against the Chinese. And the Chinese, they didn't like this at all, understandably. And so they were trying to fight back because they were just trying to live their lives. And of course, the Chinese, they weren't very good integrators. They spoke Chinese. They didn't learn Malay. They kept their Chinese culture, their Chinese language, and so forth. So it was a big problem. So it ended up with a divorce. The solution was that most of the Chinese lived in Singapore. 80% of the population was Chinese. So the Malays said, we're kicking out the hotbed of Chinese, the big Chinese city. And the Chinese sort of was okay with that because at least they were free, even though they were at war with Malaysia. So Lee Kuan Yew was the founding father of Singapore, and he experienced this multicultural, racial, ethnic civil war. So he said, never again. I'm never ever going to let multiculturalism destroy this country. And so he built his entire society on the idea that multiculturalism was poison, and that if you allow it to grow, and like ethnic tribalism, then you're just going to destroy the country. So everything in his policies was based on the idea that we're not going to let this thing grow. And he didn't write the word populism, but he basically said, I'm never ever going to allow populism to arise in this country. We're going to form the elite, like in so many other countries, but we're never ever going to give anyone a chance to be discontent. We're going to be a meritocratic elite. Everyone's going to be happy with us, and so we're trying to avoid populism by not creating the cause for populism, which is that the elites are just sucking and not doing the job.
Right.
And so that was the basis of them. So they started out with being socialists. Socialism was big in Asia at the time, but Singapore was a British colony. So Lee Kuan Yew was very well educated in British capitalism and society. So he says, okay, for a few years now, we're going to make a 5-year plan where we're going to run with capitalism, just so that we can get some social security network up and running after 5 years, then we can afford it. So he did this, and this was just hugely successful and hugely popular. So he said, okay, we're going to wait with this socialism plan. We're going to make another 5-year plan. 5 more years of capitalism. So 50 years later, they're still doing this 5 more years of capitalism. So basically they see that, okay, we were able to achieve everything we wanted and more with capitalism. So capitalism is the pillar of society. It's the backbone.
Now that's true, ladies and gentlemen, for every society, even Soviet Russia. They built all their wealth during the NEP in the 1920s, and to the extent that anybody in their society produced anything, they were free. They actually had little towns that were stocked with foreign goods, where you lived freely without the secret police looking over you. And so that's true everywhere. Capitalism's the pillar of every society, even Soviet Russia and China today.
Even though most of the food production was socialized collectivized in Soviet Russia, 1% or 0.5% was privately owned, and they made 20 to 25% of the food.
No, I heard it was very high at sometimes, 70 or 80% of certain types of food came from the private production, which was people's little private 1/10 of a hectare next to their cottage.
Right. Absolutely, but when I say that it's the pillar of society, Singapore's actually, people have to understand that in 1965 there was only less than 1 million people living in Singapore, and it was a jungle, literally a jungle. When the Japanese took over Singapore in 1940, I don't remember, 43, something like that. They came from behind. They came on bicycles through the jungle and that's how they took the British. They rode on bicycles through the jungle. So Singapore was a jungle until 1965. And then it became slums. And then it became a developed lower class city. And then it became a well-off city. And today, Singapore is the freaking richest country on earth, of normal size OECD countries. You have your Bahrain is richer, but it's pumped up on oil steroids, or steroids that I call them.
Very nice.
Yeah. And you have these tiny countries, tax havens that are richer than Singapore, but from real countries, Singapore is up there. It's much richer than the United States. And this happened in only 50 years. Can you imagine that? Singapore went from a jungle to being richer than the richest country on earth, America. in just 50 years.
Yeah,
That's just amazing.
Without a majority white population, and without long-term hundreds of years of infrastructure, without a huge cultural tradition. So yeah, I think people like who was I talking to? Oh, Tony. I had this discussion with the other night, and we were talking about how old different societies are, and he thinks France and Germany or Italy or whatever are really old countries, but they're not. They're like 40 years old. Their constitutions are very young, legally speaking. So Singapore's very young. You can build a country by having a system of laws that everybody follows and gets along, and then they just go about their way otherwise. That's what a country is. It's not necessarily a 1,000-year-old group of tribal laws and singing and dancing or something like that.
That's right. So so the way they solved immigration was this idea that we're going to prevent populism. No one is ever going to be unhappy about immigration. That was the idea. Like if so, they created the idea of the low resolution narrative, the common denominator story that people tell in their heads when they meet a foreigner. So like when you are a Singaporean citizen and you meet a foreigner, an immigrant, on the bus or wherever in Singapore, then the story that you should not have in your head is, here's a criminal, here's a terrorist, here's a moocher, a leecher, all of these negative thoughts. You want to have the story in your head. Here is someone who is law-abiding and not a threat to national security, and who is paying his own bills and is not taking jobs from locals and is only producing good things for Singapore and contributing both to himself and to others. I like this guy because he's not making any troubles. If you can have this idea, that's the first idea that pops into people's head. There's not going to be any racism or xenophobia or whatever have you. People are going to be happy about it. So, in order to achieve that, Singapore said, zero tolerance for crime and terrorism. So, like, if you make just like you can have a ticket for like a parking ticket, like civil disorder, that's okay. But if you actually do a crime as a foreigner, you're expelled immediately, which means that you as a Singaporean citizen, you're absolutely sure that every single one of the people you see on the street, they're law-abiding.
Right. Not only that, now Singapore is the place I've heard of, I think, that has the law where you'll do 10 years in jail if you spit on the sidewalk or put bubble gum on the sidewalk. Where's that at? Is that?
It's not 10. They have public caning. They try to avoid prison time because prison is like crime school. So they're saying they have a very rational approach to this. They say, well, who are these criminals? Well, the peak crime is IQ 85, regardless of race. And okay, if you tell someone who's IQ 85, oh, if you do something bad, we'll put you a long time. 5 years in prison, and the IQ 85 guy says, "Oh, 5 years." He doesn't understand that, but he understands caning, 20 lashes of caning on his butt. So, and if you're asking, people say, "Oh, it's inhumane," but just ask yourself, and ask anyone, what would you choose? 20 lashes of a cane on your butt, or 5 years in prison? It's a no-brainer.
Yeah, much more humane to just spank somebody and let them get on with their life.
That's right. So they save a lot of money from not putting them in jail. Like if it's a foreigner, they're just immediately expelled.
Yeah.
If it's very serious crime, they're put away a long time in prison. But if it's just like ordinary crimes, they're spanked. Like stealing a car, like they regard tagging as a form of terrorism. So you will be caned for tagging. If you spray paint on the walls, you will be caned for that. They regard it as an offense of absolute evil. There's no reason for putting spray paint on wall unless you just a bad human being.
That's funny.
So all the walls are absolutely clean. Now, when it comes to gum, they're not caning, but they have fines. So they have like $500 fines for spitting on the street or putting like cigarette butts or chewing gum. Like chewing gum is actually was for a long time it was illegal, and if you've been to a tropical country and stepped into wet or hot chewing gum, you'll understand why it's illegal. It's like it's really yucky and gross. So they're saying we have a bunch of monkeys here. They lived in the jungle just a few years ago. We have to train them, potty train them. So they have these high fines for these for bad behaviors, and they've actually for a long time. The first time I was in Singapore was in 2001, and at the time they were not yet potty trained. They were not completely civil at the time. Like this was only 30 years after people were living in huts and in the jungle. So all the public toilets looked really bad there. You had to bring your own toilet paper because people were assumed to steal toilet paper. And the toilets did not look very good, and people were standing on top of the toilets because they were used to crapping in a hole in the ground. So this was considered more hygienic than sitting down on on a toilet. So they were not potty trained, literally. So what they did is that they started building these special toilets for those who like to sit and squat. They're called squatter toilets. So there are alternatives for those. And then there are the civilized Western version. And they upgraded the toilets, so they now look very fresh, and they're always washed all the time. And they for a while they actually installed security cameras in the toilets, which is kind of dystopian, but it worked. If you were standing on the toilets, or if you were just peeing and crapping all over, you were fined, and they were able to find you.
Wow.
So this actually stopped. It was just potty training, and now that if you go to Singapore today, you will just be absolutely gobsmacked at how beautiful all the toilets are in the public places. Just like you can almost live in the toilets. It's so clean, it's beautiful, and they're not abusing these security cameras. Yes, you can see where you can have this Epstein like situation where they're blackmailing and so forth, but it's actually not being abused because they have a very strict laws against corruption. So if you're found to be corrupt, you're going 20 years in jail in Singapore. So they upgraded the toilets. They look beautiful, everything is clean. There's no cigarette butts. There's no spray paint tagging anywhere. And the thing is, if you're actually a civilized human being and not a monkey, then you're not really bothered by the fact that you have to pay a $500 fine for throwing chewing gum on the street. I mean, if the roads were privately owned, that's what a privately owned company probably would do. It would probably fine people based on, like, you're destroying my property.
Yeah.
And you have the broken windows effect, where when people don't see any broken windows, they're not breaking any windows. So this has actually civilized people to the extent that you don't find any trash on the street. People have actually learned to behave like decent human beings. And this has happened in only 50 years. Like living in the jungle, crapping in a hole, to becoming really civilized people in just 50 years. So it's
now
amazing.
let me just say, to integrate this with the whole conversation generally, that's what I believe about people who would come to the United States. I think that they're just forced to take on the politeness that we take for granted in society so that they can take part. And so we're going to have third world people, people from Africa or Somalia or whatever, just like we allowed Irish people or people from the far dregs of Europe to come here, and they were the lowest of the low in society at the time, and they came up in society in order to take part in society, and that's what everybody who comes to America is going to do. And if we didn't have the welfare state, then they would either sink or swim. And in the 1800s, 1 out of 3 immigrants left America because they couldn't swim, so they went back to their home country. And that's what we should have. We should allow anybody, even the lowest common denominator. And you were talking earlier about how Chinese are the Jews of the Middle East, and they are good with money and stuff. And we had all these Chinese in California, and they got kicked out because they were making more money working the tailings from white people's gold mines than the white people were making from the gold mines.
Yep.
And so they kicked them out because they didn't want them over there working up the busted rock, making more than the gold mine was. So it took 10 times as many Chinese to do it, but they did it because they had to break all the rocks to smithereens, but they did it. And so they kicked them out. And so we deported a bunch, not only deported them, but we stopped immigration. We stopped letting Chinese come here. So we could have either had an enclave of violent communists on the West Coast, or maybe a whole bunch of Americanized, Jewish-ized, money-loving Chinese Americans. Maybe half of them would have interbred by now. We could have had a huge, big population of brilliant, productive people on the West Coast, but we deported them and stopped immigration from their country. So now we're impoverished in the sense that we're 100 million people shorter than we should have been, and we might have to have a big old fight with China anyway, and it would be nice to have an extra 100 million soldiers, damn it.
Absolutely. And just to continue this thing with immigration in Singapore, the number one rule, as I said, was no criminal, like zero tolerance for crime, like zero tolerance. And number two, you have to pay the bill 100% yourself. Like I think it was in 1988 or 1995 or something like that in California that they tried to push through a bill that would have stopped the whole immigration crisis. Stefan Molyneux has a series on this on California, where he talks about that they were going to say that no illegal immigrants would get any kind of funding from the government, including public schools, and that would have stopped it. And this is what they actually did in Singapore. If you come there as an immigrant, you have to pay everything yourself. You do not get a single dime of public good, including public schools. You do not get any benefits. You have to pay for your stay 100%. And this means that people on the streets, when they see an immigrant, they know for a fact that this is not someone who is going to be a burden on them at all. And the number 3 rule is, under no circumstances can an immigrant who is just there get citizenship in Singapore very easily. They can stay there for as long as they want as a non-citizen, as long as they're working and paying. But to become an actual citizen is like insanely hard. And so therefore, they've removed one of the greatest worries of the Singaporeans, that they will become a minority in their own country, and that they will be demographically replaced by foreigners who think tribally and ethnically. So they've removed the threat of tribal civil war, which destroyed Malaysia 50 years earlier.
So how do you become a citizen then? Just being born there?
No, you have to live. First of all, you have to go through a rigorous process of applying. It's proved that you've lived there for a long time, or you have to then also possibly marry a Singaporean citizen. That's another way, through marriage. And that, Singaporeans are not very happy about marrying foreigners because they want the people to be able to pay for them. It's a society that requires that you can actually fund. So only people who are strongly capable of paying for themselves and for a wife or for someone else can become a Singaporean citizen. But if you're trying to become naturalized without marrying a Singaporean, even then even when you're marrying someone, it takes a long time. Like I knew a guy who lived in Singapore. I was living him through Airbnb. Yeah, and he had lived in Singapore for 20 years and had been married to a Singaporean for 20 years. And when I was living there, he got the message that he was becoming a Singaporean citizen after 20 years. And he was so happy about that. This is very rare and it's very difficult. And you have to prove yourself that you are patriotic, that you truly love Singapore, and that this is your home country and that you have Singaporean values and all of this.
Now,
it's very difficult.
It's just the historical example of Sparta that keeps coming to my mind.
What do you mean?
That had this very limited citizenship, and you couldn't become a citizen, and everybody else was a helot.
Oh, but the thing is, the people who come there, they're not slaves. They're working, and you don't go to Singapore to become a slave. You go there to earn money. So you have 40%. It's not like I would then think of Dubai as a better example, where you have 20% citizens and 80% non-citizens who are just working there. And Dubai is actually even a bad example because the workers in Dubai are treated quite okay compared to, like, Saudi Arabia would be a good example. That's a modern slave state. You're not treated well there if you're coming from outside. But like in Singapore, there's a reason why people want to go there. You're treated very well and you can earn very well and you enjoy it. And finally, the last thing, this is something that libertarians or objectivists generally don't like, but Singapore recognizes that there is such a thing as a bell curve. You have people who are naturally born on the lower end of the bell curve in any society. And if you're bringing in lots of people who are poor, they might be from the top end of their bell curve, but they are competing perhaps for the jobs of the low end bell curve in their own countries, like in Singapore. And so in order to avoid having a large underclass of people who will vote populist, and because they're miserable for foreigners taking their jobs, Singapore says we're going to protect our low skill workers, the people who can't become doctors and top, like the top people and whatever. So they have a degree of protectionism as a part of their way of enabling 40% of the population to be immigrants. So they say that some works are reserved for Singaporean citizens. And this includes taxi driver. You will never ever see anything other than a Singaporean taxi driver in Singapore, which usually are just old, unskilled Chinese people. It's quite fun to see that whenever you go there, you like many of the taxi drivers are like 70 years old or 60 years old.
Really?
And they don't speak English very well. They're like, I speak Chinese or have very, very bad accents. And this is the kind of work they can do. And they have an option for that. The second is like a street, like a hawker, like street restaurants, that kind of thing. They don't allow poor people from other countries to come and have that, because that would take away the jobs of the low-skilled people in their own country that are street hawkers and have these family restaurants. So there's like a huge underpopulation there that are living having these street restaurants in Singapore, and they're doing okay, and they can charge quite well because they don't have competition from these highly skilled people from other countries that are dirt poor.
Right.
And so they're doing this. They are fully aware that this is protectionism, but the alternative is to create an underclass of low-skilled people who are going to be miserable and hate immigrants and who are going to vote populist.
Yeah.
And the final thing that they're doing is that they have an arrangement for buying houses. If you're a Singaporean citizen, you can get a cheap government loan for buying a house or an apartment. And those are going to be slightly subsidized compared to the free market price that the foreigners have to pay when they live in an apartment. So it's a little bit cheaper for the local population to live. So because there are so many immigrants there and it's a tiny island, the government says we're not going to have people hating immigrants because they're pushing up the price of apartments. So we're going to try to...
So they've used the law to make it a livable place for everybody instead of like letting it be a free-for-all, in which case a whole bunch of poor people would have had to flee Singapore by now.
Yes.
Because there's a huge supply of wealth right now from China and from elsewhere too. So there's no question there. If it's a well-run country, there will be a supply of millionaires and billionaires coming in, and thousandaires even who need a better place to live than where they're from. And so they would have driven the poor people out, but instead the poor people have their economic security protected it's a limited environment. They're treating it like a finite pie.
Yep.
But from day to day, objectively, it is a finite pie.
Absolutely. And the thing is, like, they are fully aware that the alternative to doing this is civil war or a populism, right? Yeah. Populism is basically a form of civil war.
Right. If they didn't allow the situation to go where it would, which would be force poor people to evacuate the country, then the poor people would be fighting back, is what that would mean. So it would be some sort of civil war or populism, yeah.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, go ahead.
No, that's great. And so basically, the rule is whenever you meet an immigrant on the street, you're not ever going to have a negative thought. And that's what happens. There's no xenophobia in Singapore. And consider that Southeast Asia or South Asia is one of the most racist regions on the planet. Like, racism is... no one talks about racism because for the same reason that fish don't talk about water. It's endemic. It's like, it's just, this is the way life is. Everyone is tribal. But Singapore is this, like, in the middle of this ocean of racism in Southeast Asia. Then you have this place where people are not xenophobic because there's no reason to. Like, people have their preconceptions. Oh, they don't want to have an Indian, like someone from India as renting because they have smelly foods and all of that. That's you have that, but so. It's not like there's no like stereotypes, racial stereotypes and stuff like that. But you don't actually have like a movement of popular discontent based on racial tensions in Singapore, which is just amazing in an awfully racist region like that. So they've basically solved the entire problem of racism and the problem of civil war by just behaving very sensibly and always thinking about whether the politics they're pushing is going to cause discontent, popular discontent. Is this going to be a cause of populism? And if it's going to be cause of populism, then they don't do it. It's as simple as that. So I'm just trying to contrast this with America, because like everyone is talking about how big a problem it is with, the people are so racist in America because they don't want these immigrants, and we have to teach them not to be racist. And it's very, very simple to avoid racism in America or xenophobia. It's don't be an idiot, don't be an ass. That's all you have to do. Like, make a system that makes people not be afraid or have any reason to be afraid or discontent with immigration.
Well, okay, let me just mention the rooftop Koreans in Los Angeles.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Well, they did everything you said and stuff, but then at the end of the day, they had guns, and when people came for them, they shot at them.
Yep.
So that's. I think that at the end of the day, we have to keep mentioning that America's not just about being nice and getting people to, multiculturalism's nice and everything, but at the end of the day, we have guns.
That's right. And the guns are great. Like I noticed that you shared one of my tweet. It wasn't a tweet, but it was like a Facebook thing. And I said that the left and the right, the right likes the Second Amendment for the exact same reason that the left hates it, which is that it protects against totalitarianism. Yeah. And that's why they hate guns. There's no other reason for hating guns, because there's no objective reason for making all that qualm about like the mass shooting and all of that. That's just bullshit. What I was trying to do here now is to use Singapore as a way of explaining how it's possible to do things right. And if you are an objectivist, you don't talk about what I just talked about. You're saying, oh, Trump is rude, or Trump is a socialist, and Hillary Clinton is a socialist, therefore they're just as bad. Which is very, I think it was you who said that, like, my definition of an objectivist, which I think I got from you, is that if you during World War II had said Churchill is a socialist and Hitler is a socialist, therefore they're equally bad, and we're not going to support Churchill against Hitler because both are socialists.
Yeah.
Then you're an objectivist. Then you're a complete moron and an idiot.
Right.
Because that is context dropping of paramount proportions. I mean, it's just it's awful. And I think that this is the problem with what we refer to as objectivists now.
Now, I just want to, before you pass it, I just want to mention the argument of whether or not we should have armed Russia. Because some people think that we would do well to fight Germany but not have armed Russia, and we maybe should not only not have armed them, but maybe we needed to arm them. I don't know. Where do you stand on it? You think that was good of us to arm Russia?
I am not sure, but I listened to your conversation yesterday about China and how we've basically built up and armed China, and now we thought that we're going to fight communism, but communism, you can't fight communism by giving communists lots of stuff.
Yeah.
Because what happened is that Deng Xiaoping, he's sort of like a hero to many on the right, because he basically took a 180-degree turn away from Mao's awful communism, and looked at Hong Kong and said, we're going to do as Hong Kong does. And whenever people complain to him, he says, oh, no, this is not capitalism. This is socialism with Chinese characteristics. And we should have listened to him, because he was actually serious about that. And what's happened is that the Chinese Communist Party is saying, we're going to sit and wait for things to be improved so much that we can complete our dream society, communism.
Yeah. It's NEP. It's the NEP that Russia did all over again.
Yeah. So I'm leaning a little bit towards that arming Russia may have been a bad idea. I don't know enough about the war, whether we needed the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, you know that they killed 20-1 Germans.
What do you mean?
Compared to the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, 20-1. We killed 1 German and they killed 19 Germans.
Who killed 19 Germans?
The Russians. And
I see.
America and Churchill and France and Italy killed 1, not Italy, but America.
I see, 20-1. Okay, I see. It may have been necessary, but I like to believe that probably not. The thing I do know is that we had the the Red Decade, the 1930s, and during that time, you had the communists were infiltrating America in every area, like in Hollywood, of course, but also in government. And and we know that China was lost because of a communist infiltrator in America who said, no, this Mao guy is really nice, and we shouldn't be supporting this nationalist, the other guy. He's the guy who went to Taiwan.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't know, it's very difficult to say, but it's a little bit would have, could have, should have thing. Like things happen the way they did. I think we can learn from it, and we should try to, generally speaking, avoid putting ourselves in a situation where we have to make bad choices.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also we should realize that those our great granddad or granddad or fathers, in some case, some of our dads were there in World War II. We should realize that they did the best that they could, and we had ought to try to improve on it and preserve their system. Second guessing it is fine, but like they worked hard and sacrificed blood and tears to give us the system that they gave us. Like,
yes.
Maybe that was a stupid choice to send a bunch of stuff to Russia, because then they used those factories for decades, you know, and they never would have had those factories. So maybe that was stupid, but what are we going to do today if we get in a big war? Are we going to ship a bunch of stuff to somebody and say, please, just start shooting at them, please? You know, and we might do that. We might end up doing that.
That is the very passive aggressive way of doing things. It's like we didn't do it. Nobody saw us do it. You can't prove anything. And to quote Bart Simpson.
Yeah. And let me pause and just say one quick thing. It might have been very genius of our fathers and grandfathers to send those factories over there, because look at the fact that they did end up killing 19-1 Germans. So maybe that was rather wise of our. Maybe we had to, the price we paid was the Cold War. Russia never would have had that productive capacity.
Obviously.
Yeah, if we wouldn't have given it to them, they never would have been able to build that productive capacity. So we fought the Cold War, so it was a big, long, expensive war. But, gee, I don't know, maybe we could have whipped Germany anyway, and they never could have beat Russia. Anyways, let's get off of it, because let's not second-guess history as we go. But anyways, what were you saying? Go ahead and continue. I'm sorry.
Actually, I was sort of put a little bit off track because it was an interesting topic, but I was talking about how we should definitely learn from positive examples rather than talking only about the negative consequences of things.
Yeah.
Like we can say, look to Venezuela. Yes, we can do that, but look to Singapore.
Mm-hmm.
They've managed to have much more immigration than America has, and no one's unhappy about it because no one can demographically replace Singaporeans, and they're only getting the good people. They're picking from the top. Yeah. They're not picking from the bottom.
I'm only worried about the really long term. Like 50 years is fine for that type of system, but what about 200 years? But I don't know. Maybe it's a solid city state. A city state can be a thing, but is that how much can we use that for our empire, for the American empire?
Yeah, I think that.
And America's not an empire. I shouldn't say that so flippantly.
I understand. I think that
we have to govern everything from Alaska to Puerto Rico and everything in between. And we've got to watch out for South America. We've got to keep them in mind when we have world policy, because they're our neighborhood, and we've told the world that for a long time. South America's our neighborhood. And Japan and South Korea and Britain and India and Australia. We got to include all these people in what sort of system we think about building in the American sphere. And when I say Britain, I mean the Western European tradition, the whole everything west of the Berlin Wall that we defended through the Cold War. And Poland's not so bad either. We started the goddamn Second World War to defend Poland, so maybe we ought to defend them too. And so we've got to. So Singapore's got limited citizenship and stuff. I don't want limited citizenship in America. I want anchor babies in America. I want people to come here and build a life, but I just don't want a welfare state.
But that's the thing. You can't have both at the same time.
But I think we might
have a welfare state. The anchor babies are going to destroy your country. We see this in Sweden now.
But
very close to the volcano.
If we get rid of the welfare state, then will you let me have anchor babies and easy citizenship?
No. The reason.
Come on.
What I want is
if I have millions of acres, billions of acres of land, then can I do it?
Yeah.
Then I could do it?
Possibly, but here's the thing. The thing is that a citizen, someone who's actually going to vote, now that's what you have to consider.
Right.
Every anchor baby is a gun.
Yeah, well, what if voting wasn't really that powerful? What if it...
now then you were talking. Then, like, if you can remove the gun of voting, then anchor babies wouldn't be a problem. So
yay! Okay.
So it is the voting that makes up this problem. So you have with the way I think of it, the United States was actually conceived of in a very nice way. It's like it was considered as being a very loose federation. It is a nation, like it's not a confederation, although the Confederates might have not liked that much. But the idea is that you have just a very thin veneer of government on top that unites everyone together, and then the individual states in the union are actually the ones doing this. And if you have that, then you have the reproductive strategy, where you have 50 playgrounds to play with. And if one state wants to be a socialist hellhole, they can do that as long as they don't impose any problems on anyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a beautiful system. People can leave California still. There's no barbed wire around it.
That's right. So the thing is that the whole thing that screws this thing up is voting. Because today the system of if you have a system that produces wealth produces attracts people who are not wealth producers, and they're not necessarily parasites, but they are just they are not someone who's going to defend liberty.
Yeah.
So sadly, wealth produces its own demise because of voting. And that is basically the problem.
It's not strictly voting, it's the fact that they can vote and the government then can do these things. So if we took the power away for the government to do these things, then you went and voted for some clown who then just sits in an office somewhere and draws a paycheck for a couple of years and then leaves, then that would... But then that means society's going on despite what the clowns say. And that's not the system we have. Everything's dependent on what the clowns say right now. So the problem is that everything's dependent on what the clowns say. Voting isn't really a problem. Like in the 1800s, it really didn't matter who you voted in America. He didn't really have much power to do anything. Unless a war started, he was really powerless. And even when a war started, he wasn't that powerful. It was still up to Congress to do a lot of the stuff.
That's right. So I like that way of thinking. The problem is that that's sort of utopian. It's far away. We're not going to get there.
We've got it. America's got that system.
No, you used to have that system, and now democracy has been snuck in the back door, and the Republican part of the system has been destroyed.
Now, do you know? I think you're right if you were to say that about Europe. I think that this is like the 1930s, and Europe's going to go through the goddamn ringer, and it's going to be ugly. And America is doing the same thing. We're having our red decade, but we're going to get out with a lot. We've got Trump, baby. Like, we've got Trump. We just had the best quarter in manufacturing growth in 30 years because so many companies are repatriating to the United States because Trump's cutting all the loopholes and stuff like this, and you can't just build a factory somewhere and employ a bunch of slave labor and import the money to America for free anymore, like you could under the Clintons, under a corrupt free trade system where we can go to any slave pen anywhere in the world and build a factory and pay people nothing and import the stuff tariff-free to America and shut down the factory in America. Trump put an end to all that, and now we have manufacturing growth and more manufacturing jobs coming in the last quarter than in the last any time in the last 30 years. So, does protectionism work? For who?
So I found your discussion of protectionism quite interesting. That the one way to think of protectionism is as a form of a boycott. You're saying basically that some countries we're going to boycott them, and how do you have like a government boycott of a country? You put on a tariff on that, and if there was a system in place, like not an actual, like, here's tariff, random, someone picked it out of a hat, but a system for creating tariffs. Where basically you're saying, we're saying in advance to the entire world, this is how we create tariffs. We're going to create an index of the shithole index. And if you score high on the shithole index, we're going to tariff you to the moon, yeah. And that's basically it. So if you want to have low tariffs, other countries can actually impact them by not behaving like assholes.
Yeah, I think there would be some combination of the two. In America, it was a 5% flat tariff on everything that crossed to the border or came in through the ports. 5% yes. Flat. Now, you ask why 5%? I would say, well, it just depends on the budget of the federal government. How big of a federal government do you want? Because that's how big your tariff gets to be. Now, if you want the federal government to be huge and bloated, then you're going to have to push that tariff really high, but that's going to raise the cost of the industry inside your country, because your country needs a certain amount of stuff from overseas. It's going to need things. So you're going to cripple your own country if you raise that tariff too high. Any tariff's going to cost your country, ultimately. That's where the cost comes from. So keep that tariff as low as you can, but the only source of revenue you have for the federal government is that tariff, so be careful. Don't set it too high.
I do like that, and I like the idea of, like, if you have it's just like you're pegging the dollar to gold. If you were able to peg the tariffs to some kind of shithole index, that would be great, because then you're actually saying the total amount is going to be like enough to pay for the federal government. That's basically how high the tariffs will ever go. But the individual tariffs based on various countries is depending on how much they score on this shithole index.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We should definitely have that, like the Muslim countries when we did the Tripoli War and all that stuff, and we would have a group of countries, we say nobody can trade with them, or it's 99% tariff or 200% tariff or something like that.
Yes, so I would love a kind of system like that, because then you were both financing the government in part, but at the same time you're actually doing morally good. It's a moral system. You're saying that because Saudi Arabia has slaves and they're treating people awfully, therefore we have tariffs on their system. But Poland, it's very nice, and they're not really behaving badly, and they're doing okay. They're behaving well. They're treating their people okay. Therefore, we're not having tariffs as much on Poland or Hong Kong or whatever.
Now, it occurs to me: what if we pegged it by the value of trade of their currency versus ours, and the value of their currency would result from the productivity of their citizenry, which would result from how free their citizens were.
No, but the problem is, like, Saudi Arabia, oil, they can have
that's a whole other thing. That's our oil, and we'd ought to have that. But we're in the situation we are now. We've let them take it, and we've let them have it. So,
yeah. So the point is that like China, they are treating their citizen very badly, and they're able to have like America is importing a lot, and they're keeping their currency unnaturally high by buying American debt. But so there are ways for other countries to manipulate that kind of thing. But if you have a system that is pegged to a moral index, how can anyone actually be against that? We're saying that we're only punishing people who are immorally buying slave labor products. That's all basically what we're doing.
Yeah. Now, yeah, and I would say, sounds good. Let me see the system. So, the system would have to be looked at by the representatives every year, and we would have to decide which country. So would it be like a scientific, we would get their economic report, or would it be just newspaper reports? Oh, we heard the government's doing this.
We would do it basically like Heritage Foundation does with the Heritage Freedom Index. Economic Freedom Index.
Yeah, see, I'm suspicious of that because America's the freest country in the world. Like they mentioned,
no, it's not.
Yeah, I know. They mention these other countries that are free in such and such a way, and yet you get arrested for something you post on Twitter.
No. They specifically say economic freedom, right?
Yeah. That's what I mean. It's in a vacuum, and I don't think that that's really very meaningful. America's.
No,
In spite of these things, America is still a freer country and will be able to maintain its freedom better and longer than these other supposedly freer countries.
I understand, but like when you're evaluating economic freedom, that's one dimension.
Okay, all right.
Fair
enough.
I wasn't suggesting that you should use the Heritage Economic Freedom Index as the only measure. In fact, based on that, there are some countries that are treating their people quite badly that would score high on economic freedom. But some kind of similar effort of creating a shithole index.
Yeah.
Where we're scoring people on various kinds of dimensions. One is economic freedom. If it's high in economic freedom, that gives that drags the score up, or they're less shitholy. And another may be like labor treatment and so forth, and another may be the freedom of like the self-expression freedoms, like freedom for gays, freedoms for reproductive rights, freedom for freedom of speech, all of these things, the like civil liberties. That might be one dimension, and so forth. And you combine them up to make like a total dimension, not like a total index. And if everyone was basically agreed on this, like, okay, we like this index that you've created. Now we only have to sort of have scientists who makes that judgment on a yearly basis. So the index is updated once a year, just like the Heritage Index, and it's being vetted so that you have many independent groups that look at the index and say that, no, we don't like this number here that you did. You did a bad job in this particular sub-index.
This all sounds fine, but the problem is that the people who are going to take over and run this system are going to be leftists by nature, because the individualists are off ignoring these people doing their own thing. And the leftists are going to own and run this system. That's what...
Yeah, that's a general problem. That this is not true only of this kind of system. It's true of any kind of system. And I think that we haven't talked about it at all. Like I've been listening a lot to Jordan Peterson, and he's an interesting character, a mixed bag, but interesting. And one of the things that he's talking about, he's trying to use like mythopoetic language, metaphorical language, as a way of understanding things more easily and more intuitively. And one of the metaphors that I like is that there's always going to be a snake in the garden. The serpent is like a source of evil, and even if you have a walled garden, it's paradise. You cannot make paradise. There's always going to be a snake.
Yeah.
And
It's a good metaphor, and it tells you to be wary, and it tells you that the biblical worst thing, the snake, is not only there, but he's always there. Yeah,
yes,
it's an analogy. It's a really good. Jesus spoke in parables, and those parables were powerful for a reason. Don't
yeah.
don't build your house on sand. Build it on a rock. Brilliant. Okay, so.
Yeah. So we don't have to get into all the Jordan Peterson stuff here, but I was just lifting off that analogy, that metaphor, which I think is very insightful, because it does actually change the way you think. Because if you're a utopian, you're only just one execution away from utopia, right? If you just chop off one more head, then you'll have paradise.
Yeah, just get rid of that last guy that keeps bothering us.
Yes.
Anytime one guy pops up, use the hammer and pop him down.
But it doesn't work like that. That's not how it works. If you chop off one head, 3 new one grows,
Yeah.
like in the myth, and the Hydra myth, and this is the problem. Once you realize that evil is always going to be there, it's always going to be a source of a problem, and it's not us versus them, but it's a potential that lies within everyone. Like you're not sure that your intentions are always good. There's a huge undersea of subconscious and unconscious motivations in your depth.
Well, it's not us versus them, because there is no us, there's no group, and there's no them, there's no group, there's only individuals.
And even within an individual, there's also split motivations.
Yeah, but I'm not worried about the split motivations coming for me with a gun. I'm worried about everybody out there. So really, it's me against everybody out there. That's what the real metaphysical thing is the individual against everybody, really, metaphysically. So now we see why Mr. Cropper keeps saying that guns are important and ownership of guns are important, because it's you
Absolutely.
against everybody.
Absolutely. But the point is that vigilance is an absolute requirement for maintaining liberty, because it's not going to maintain itself. There are going to be corrupting forces.
The tree of liberty. What does the tree of liberty need?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
When does it need it?
So once you realize that there's always going to be socialists, there's always going to be bad people, there's always going to be people who are envious. The story of Cain and Abel is the old story, and the first story about humans in the Bible, where the envious Cain kills his Abel brother. I mean, that's just like the story of socialism, right there from the beginning. And in the story, it ends well for Cain. He says that God will protect Cain from revenge. So his children is going to be protected for all generations. So basically, it's a story about, envy, socialism. It's here to stay. It's part of the human story, and it's scary. But once you start thinking about that we're not really getting rid of these guys. You can argue all you want, but it's like rust. It's always going to be there. You have to maintain the system all the time. Weeds. You have to always weed the garden.
You have to polish the silverware.
Yep. And once you start thinking about that, then you see that it's entropy, and we just have to have a system in place, and you have to always be vigilant that things don't maintain themselves.
Now wait, don't we get anything that's made out of gold that we don't have to maintain? Yes, you get one set of axioms, or you get a philosophy, or else you get a constitution. You get one piece of gold. Everything else you have to is your silver you have to rub down, and your horse you have to feed.
That's right. So I think that what the best strategy for protecting liberty is the reproductive strategy, which means that you can't have only one free nation. You have to have a multitude of free nations, and if one of them goes south, then you have others that maintain liberty. So there's always going to be a failure, but it's okay.
Now, see, that's why I was saying earlier, we need to, like, I like Singapore's system, but I want to endorse a system that I can say, India, come on board, Australia, come on board. We've got Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, we got Mexico, we got Brazil, we got Venezuela's kind of falling apart, but they're in our pockets, so don't anybody fuck around with them, because they're ours. It's our mess, That's a South American mess. That's not a European or a Russian mess or a Chinese mess. That's a South American mess, and it will stay a South American mess if America has anything to do with it. China's not going to send troops into Venezuela.
That's right.
And they fucking know they're not. Everybody knows that Russia is not putting troops into Venezuela. So, that's what I mean by that.
Now, I completely understand what you're saying, and I'm not against this idea of go forth and multiply, but there has to be a system in place. And what's happening now is that America is bringing in people who are not liberty oriented and who stay unfree in their minds for generation after generation. So the path that America is on right now is the destruction of America, and sadly. So precisely this anchor baby thing only works if the anchor babies can't destroy the system. And at the moment they can. And therefore, it's just exacerbating the problem. So there has to be a way to first create the system that allows for anchor babies not to be a problem. I would love to see that.
Given the system we have right now, just as it is, it's a shit show. But given what we have right now, I believe the system can be saved and we can make it another 50 or 100 years as a free country if we can have a big phenomenon of Candace Owens and Kanye West and Thomas Sowell and name another black intellectual on the right. Sheriff.
The sheriff guy. I forget his name.
David something, Sheriff.
Yeah, I forget his name.
He was just on the Candace Owens show again.
I saw him. Yeah.
So
I think that there are 13% blacks in America, and if they sort of understood that they are house Negroes at the moment for the Democratic Party, and they're treated as such, if they might change their allegiance and come aboard the Trump train, and that would be it.
We only need half of them, and that would really swing things if we had half of the blacks.
Well, the Democratic Party would actually just have to change completely if that happened.
They're imploding. The Democratic Party's imploding. It's
you have all the progressives, and they're bringing out the popcorn. The more we have of AOC and all these crazy people, the more they're destroying themselves. And I just love it because people get to see the comrade communism in action. I don't there was this clip that's going around from the Democratic Socialists Convention. They literally say comrades, they say the Soviet Union wasn't real socialism, but comrades.
But we're going to use their language because they were so great.
Yeah. They're making themselves losers. Like the Green New Deal, it was so bad that
they're losers, but they can raise trouble if they take power and won't let anybody else talk and have any say, and that's what's happening in Europe. The losers run the whole fucking show. Now, I don't know if Norway's as bad as it's gotten in France, but yeah.
No, this is a little bit different. These people in Europe, they are not losers. They are what I would call Nazis with a bad conscience. They're feeling guilty Nazis. So they are white supremacists who feel bad about it. So they want to be pay reparations for being supreme. So this is especially true for Sweden, who supported Hitler during World War II. So they are feeling really bad about being Nazis and being like the home of eugenics and all of this. And they want to destroy themselves in order to prove that they're supreme. And I'm not kidding about that. A couple of years ago, the prime minister said that Sweden was what did he? The term he used, it was absolutely insane. A moral superpower.
Yikes. Wow.
Sweden refer to themselves as a moral superpower. In other words, they're saying, we're so good, we're so much better than everyone else, and we're going to rule the world because everyone's going to look at us, because look at us, we're so moral, and everyone's just going to copy us because look at us. And it's like, that really represents the Swedish elite there. Well, it's a form of white supremacism, with feeling guilty about it. So they want to be like it's like the feminine version of Nazism. Hitler was the masculine Nazi, and the Swedes are the feminazis, the feminine Nazis. They want to take care of everyone in a really Nazi way. And I'm not exaggerating, because this is what they take people in specifically from awful countries because they regard them as inferior, and that is the reason they take them in. So if there's someone coming to Sweden who's actually like capable and able, they don't like them. They don't want them there because they're able. They're not inferior. So they don't deserve to be there to be taken care of by the super Nazis.
Uh-huh. Wow, interesting view of it. And you're from Norway. That's right next door. So we
see this all the time. Like we talk about the Swedish condition. It's like whenever things go really bad, like anarchy or something is breaking out in Norway, it's like, oh, this is almost like Swedish conditions here. Mm-hmm. Norwegians are like just looking at it with absolute horror at what's going on in Sweden. And Denmark is even more scared about this. So Denmark has proposed introducing like border control to Sweden. They actually want to have a wall. Well, not literally a wall, but like they want to have border control between. These are like neighbor countries that have always have been open. You can pass through. There's been open borders between the Scandinavian countries always. Yeah, there's never been an issue.
Like Copenhagen, and now there, right?
Denmark is actually talking about introducing border control to a friendly country that they've never had any border control with.
Yeah, and they just recently finished with the big old bridge, so they can just drive back and forth.
Yes, so, but they're seeing that they're coming so much crap.
No sooner do they build the rainbow than they realize that the rainbow's just a pile of shit at one end.
Yeah, that's right.
So much for open borders.
I use every opportunity when I talk to Swedes to tell them that they're awful.
Well, what's that? Hey, tell me about Finland. What's going on with them? Are they just really, they've been heavily influenced by Russia forever, but I just don't know much about Finland. Tell me a little bit about what's going on up there.
Finland is just generally happy that no one's discovered them. So they hope they're just can sit back and let the shit show pass, which is more or less what's happened.
What's the population of Finland? They've got Helsinki.
About 5 million.
5 million. Jesus, they're just tiny.
I'm actually a quarter Finnish. From my mother's side, she's half Finnish. So I actually know a little bit about Finland just based on having done some research. But Finland is right next door to the Baltic countries, like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. And Estonia is actually, they speak a language that they can understand in Finland. It's next door to Finland. Like Helsinki is the closest city to Estonia. It's just across the fjord or the sea.
From Tallinn.
Very short trip. And they can understand each other's language. They have the same culture. Everything is more or less the same, but with one exception. The Estonians are super nationalistic, whereas the Finnish people are not so much. So the Baltic countries were inside the Iron Curtain, inside of the Soviet sphere, and therefore they are just so freaking happy that they're free and they have their own nation. And there's just not going to come any foreigners in there and destroy their newly created freedom. Finland was also very happy to be free because they lived next door down to awful Russia, and they lost a lot of land in World War II. But they have been free for 60 years, so they're less ethnocentric than Estonia, which is right next door. So basically, I'm actually writing an article about this right now, that the more a society has experienced crushing totalitarianism, the more ethnocentric they become. Because they value having a freedom of their own, being their own masters in their own home. So they're brought together by the totalitarianism.
Is ethnocentrism, is that the long-term stable thing, ethnocentrism?
No. It's like Africa and the Islamic world is extremely ethnocentric. Like people don't in America, people think that America is the most racist country in the world, which means that they've just never opened any book or never been outside of America, because like America scores consistently among the least racist countries in the world. This is true for all the West. If you want to find the absolutely most racist countries in the world, you could just go to the Islamic world, and also you'll find a lot of racism in Africa, in Southeast or in South Asia, and also in the former communist countries.
Everywhere. You just listed everywhere.
Yeah, I didn't list South America. They're a little bit less racist.
They're pretty racist. They're actually racist amongst themselves.
Yes, they're very racist, but they're not nearly as racist as in the Middle East.
Yeah, I'm sure. But the Brazilians look down on the Mexicans
of course.
as inferior.
They're very ethnocentric.
Yeah. But your point
stands.
stands.
Compared to Africa, they're like open border systems. So what the leftist historians do when they look at history and look at racism elsewhere, they say racism is actually invented by the West. We are the most racist, or racist ideologies were invented here, and racism didn't exist until white man came along. If you go to Africa, they were not racist. They did not think about race because everyone was black and they were like tribal, but they didn't think about the fact that they were all blacks, and so they were fighting each other over tribal reasons, but not over racial reasons. This is what you hear the typical leftists say, and what they don't realize is that what they have just done there is to say that they are all black. If you ask a black if they're in Africa, if all Africans are just black, they will look at it. What do you mean? We're all black. Like the neighbor's tribe is a completely different race from our tribe. So their racism is so much on steroids that a race is like the size of a tribe. So in the African typically views themselves as having like 100,000 races.
Right. And we think of them as one homogenous thing, yeah.
Yes, whereas we are saying, but they're so similar, there's so much similarity here, and so therefore we're treating them as if they're one race. But it's like, and they in Africa, what the hell are you talking about? Those Bushmen are awful humans. We have to kill them. Mm. Like,
it also doesn't work with white people, because look at Germany and Britain. You go and then France too. Fuck France. You got these systems. So there's white people systems. What are you going to do with that? Germany versus Britain. How is that a white people system that we're, so some people talk about it being a and then so whites are not a huge megalithic thing, just like blacks are not a huge megalithic
Just
thing.
if to take a better example than Germany, I would take Russia.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of whites there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're definitely not like Britain or America,
or
like,
even Germany. They're not even like Germany.
Yeah, very, very different. So you can use race as like a very bad statistical thing. It's like having bad eyesight, so you get some information from it, but you lose a lot of information when you're just looking at race. I guess this is part of Objectivism too. I've heard Yaron Brooks talk about race. I generally have much respect for Yaron Brooks when he talks about things that he knows about. But when he's talking about things that are outside his purview, he sounds like a leftist because he defaults to the things that he thinks is correct, that he's heard other people talk about, which is generally crap. Because most of the things you hear in universities is crap.
Give me examples there. I mean, I love Yaron Brook, and I very seldom criticized him. So what do you mean there what's the
he rejects the notion that IQ has anything to do with genes, that there's no genetics behind IQ, then IQ is just something that is a social construct, it's not real, and there are definitely not racial differences in IQ, and if there are definitely not genetic statistical differences. And what's this race thing anyways? Race doesn't mean anything, blah, 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 kind of thing.
All right, yeah.
And it's like, you can acknowledge the existence of race without being a racist.
Yeah.
Just like
I like the guy who wrote the bell curve.
Yeah.
He says Charles Murray. Yeah, he says we ought to be able to discuss race and IQ without everybody running screaming from the room. Okay.
Yes, but the problem is this: I do understand why people I have great sympathy for the race and IQ question, because it's basically the nuclear question. Like, even before you start talking anything about facts, it's like, well, if you start talking about facts about how you create a nuclear bomb, you better be careful. Like, and if you talk about facts about the nuclear codes, how if you have the nuclear codes of how to actually trigger a nuclear war, you should be very careful with that information.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that the stuff regarding race and IQ can be argued to be like the nuclear codes. It's very nuclear, very explosive material that can lead to bad things. So
so maybe we shouldn't put it on billboards.
That's right. So the basic argument is this: if people believe that some races are less intelligent on average than others, then this leads to white supremacy, and white supremacy leads to slavery and to Jim Crow and to the Holocaust. So therefore, we shouldn't talk about IQ. Yeah. So basically, you go from IQ to Holocaust very quickly, or from IQ to slavery or Jim Crow.
Yeah, it's a pretty quick jump in the view. Yeah.
But I'm very sympathetic to that. Like, we should discuss, before we talk about whether IQ and race is real, we should really talk about, is it really true that this chain of events must take place?
Yeah.
And
see, I don't know. Like, what? I don't see where does it. Like, okay, so we can talk about statistics of people who answer IQ tests and versus the melanin in their skin or the region of the world they came from. Now, what does that tell us about any given individual? Because we've got brilliant individuals like Candace Owens and the sheriff, and we've got...
It tells us nothing about the individual.
Yeah, exactly. It tells us nothing. So
that doesn't mean that it doesn't give us information.
Okay, so it gives us information about large portions of the globe.
Yes. So, for instance, if we learn that the average IQ for people who live in high latitudes, in other words, Arctic peoples, if there's a correlation between latitude and IQ, then we should expect to see more as more civilized or more developed countries in high latitudes than in tropical countries.
And Russia would be probably the most civilized of all.
No, but then you have like North Korea, South Korea, like basically the same kind of people, same culture, same IQ, same ethnicity, same language, same geography, same climate. One is awful, one is okay.
Yeah, that goes down to the laws. Yeah, yeah.
So we're not talking about that this is very, very precise, but it gives you some statistics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly Russia, Finland, Norway, and Sweden are better off than Zimbabwe, Congo, Liberia, and Namibia, to name 4 random African countries. I didn't think I was going to get 4 random African countries, but I got them.
Yeah. But where this is actually important. Excuse me. I think I need to have a coughing break for 2 minutes.
Sure.
Okay?
You know what? I got to refill my water glass. So, ladies and gentlemen,
Okay,
take your bathroom breaks now. Okay.
All right.
In fact, what I'll do, ladies and gentlemen, is I'm going to put this on part 1.